The Americans tried, the Soviets tried, the French tried, the Germans tried. Every major military power in the world spent decades and billions trying to build a fighter jet that could take off vertically, hover, and then fly at combat speed. They all failed, except one. A small team at Hawker Siddeley in Kingston upon Thames built the Harrier, and it changed warfare. But before you can appreciate what they did, you have to understand the problem they solved. Because vertical takeoff isn't just difficult, it's the kind of difficult that breaks entire nations' aerospace industries. Here's the basic physics. To lift off vertically, a jet engine must produce more thrust than the total weight of the aircraft. Every pound of airframe, fuel, weapons, pilot, ejection seat, the engine has to beat all of it, pointed straight down, with zero help from the wings. Wings generate nothing at zero airspeed. They're dead weight. And here's where it gets cruel. Jet engines are heavy. Fuel is heavy. So you need a bigger engine to lift the heavier aircraft. But the bigger engine adds weight, which means you need an even bigger engine. It's a death spiral. Every VTOL designer in history has slammed face first into it. And that's just the start. In a hover, your ailerons don't work. Your rudder doesn't work. Your elevators don't work. None of the flight controls that keep a normal aircraft stable do anything at all, because they need airflow to function, and there isn't any. You're balanced on a column of thrust like a broomstick on a fingertip. One gust of wind and you're rolling, pitching, tumbling, with no aerodynamic way to correct it. So you need reaction control jets at the wingtips, nose and tail, bleeding compressed air from the engine to keep yourself pointed upright. More weight, more complexity, more things to fail. Then comes the transition. You've got to accelerate from hover into forward flight, passing through a speed range where you're too fast to hover safely, but too slow for your wings and controls to bite. This transition corridor killed more VTOL test pilots than any other phase of flight. And there's hot gas ingestion. Your engine exhaust, at over 600 degrees Celsius, blasts off the ground and recirculates right back into the intakes. The engine starts breathing its own superheated, oxygen-starved exhaust. Thrust collapses. The ground beneath you cracks and melts. Debris gets flung into the turbine. So the challenge, taken whole: build a fighter that lifts its own weight vertically, controls itself without aerodynamic surfaces, survives the transition to wing-borne flight, doesn't choke on its own exhaust, and still arrives over the target with enough fuel and weapons to actually fight. The best engineers on Earth spent 30 years trying. Here's what happened. The Americans went first. Biggest defense budget on the planet. Most technically accomplished aerospace industry in history. They attacked the problem from every conceivable angle. In the early 1950s, they tried tail-sitters, aircraft that launched straight up like rockets, then pitched over to fly. The Convair XF-Y1 Pogo, first flown in 1954, was a delta-winged turboprop that actually achieved vertical takeoff and transition to level flight. Test pilot James Coleman flew it with extraordinary skill. But landing was the problem. The pilot had to fly backwards, looking over his shoulder, decelerating to zero airspeed and settling onto his tail on a tiny platform. In dead calm air, it was harrowing. On a pitching carrier deck, fantasy. The Navy killed the program. Ryan Aeronautical built the X-13 Vertijet around the same time. a small delta-wing jet that took off vertically from a trailer-mounted platform using a hook and cable system. Between 1955 and 1957, the X-13 demonstrated vertical takeoff, transition, and vertical landing. It even flew from a car park to the Pentagon as a publicity stunt. Impressive footage, useless aircraft. No weapons, no radar, no range. The Air Force walked away without ordering a single one. Through the 1960s, American designers tried increasingly exotic approaches. The Bell X-14, the Lockheed XV-4 Hummingbird, which attempted ejector augmentation, mixing engine exhaust with ambient air to boost lift. A technical dead end. The first prototype crashed in June 1964, killing test pilot Leonard Sutton during a hover demonstration. The rebuilt second prototype crashed again in 1969. The Ryan 15-5A Vertifan buried lift fans in the wings and nose, mechanically nightmarish. One prototype crashed in October 1966, killing Army test pilot Captain Lou Everett. Dead pilots, cancelled contracts, wreckage. But the real humiliation was still coming. The Rockwell XF V-12A. This wasn't a research curiosity. This was the United States Navy's serious, fully funded program to build a supersonic VTOL fleet defense fighter. Mach 2 capable, thrust-augmented wing technology, where exhaust from a Pratt & Whitney F401 engine would be ducted through the wings and canards, ejecting downward to generate vertical lift. The wind tunnel data looked promising. The Navy invested heavily. Then they built it. When the single XF V-12A prototype was placed on the test stand at NASA Langley in 1978 for tethered hover trials, the thrust augmentation system produced 55% of predicted lift. 55. The aircraft couldn't generate enough force to lift its own weight. A supersonic VTOL fighter, built by one of America's premier aerospace contractors, for the most powerful navy in the world, sat on a test stand and could not get off the ground. $200 million in 1970s money, an aircraft that literally refused to fly. The Navy cancelled it in 1981. That was it. The last serious American attempt to build a domestic VTOL combat aircraft. Done. So what about the Soviets? The Yakovlev Yak-38, NATO codename Forger, entered service in 1976. The Soviet Union's only operational VTOL combat aircraft. It used one Tumansky R-28 cruise engine with two rotating rear nozzles, plus two separate Rybinsk RD-38 lift jets crammed behind the cockpit. Those lift jets? Dead weight during forward flight, they produced nothing in cruise. But the aircraft carried them, their fuel lines, their controls, their mass, throughout every single mission. The performance penalties were devastating. Combat radius in VTOL mode, 130 kilometers. Maximum weapons load in vertical takeoff, roughly 1,000 kilograms. Less than half the Harrier GR3's 2,270 kilograms. During deployments aboard the carrier Minsk in the Indian Ocean, tropical heat degraded performance so badly the aircraft could barely take off with any weapons at all. Pilots described it as a training vehicle in hot conditions, not a weapon system, a prop. Its safety record was so appalling that Yakovlev fitted an automatic ejection system, the SK-3M, which fired the pilot out of the cockpit without his input if certain parameters were exceeded during hover. Think about that. The aircraft was so likely to kill its pilot that the engineers built in an automatic override because the pilot wouldn't react fast enough to save himself. The Yak-38 retired in 1991 without firing a shot in anger. Western intelligence consistently rated it as a political symbol, not a weapon system. A way to put jets on Kiev-class carriers and claim parity with the West. Not a machine designed to fight. The Soviets knew it wasn't enough. The Yak-141 Freestyle, supersonic, thrust-vectoring main engine, 2 lift jets, first flew in March 1987, went supersonic in 1989, and showed genuine promise. Then, the Soviet Union collapsed. One of 2 prototypes was severely damaged in a landing accident aboard the carrier Admiral Gorshkov in September 1991, when its nozzle failed to vector properly. The program died with the state that funded it. And Europe? France built the Dassault Mirage 3. 9 engines to get 1 aircraft off the ground. 1 Snecma TF306 main engine and 8 Rolls-Royce RB162 lift jets buried in the fuselage. The complexity was absurd. 8 additional sets of fuel lines, intakes, exhausts. Before the full-scale aircraft, Dassault built a smaller proof of concept, the Balzac 5. It crashed on January 10, 1964, killing test pilot Jacques Pignet. Rebuilt. Crashed again on the 8th of September 1965, killing American exchange pilot Major Philip Neal. 2 crashes, 2 dead pilots, 1 demonstrator. The full-scale Mirage 3 hit Mach 2.04 in September 1966, the fastest VTOL aircraft ever flown. Didn't matter. Range in VTOL mode was pitiful. Weapons capacity negligible. The maintenance burden of 9 engines was insanity. Cancelled. Germany's EWR-VJ101 used 6 engines, 4 in rotating wingtip pods, 2 fixed lift jets. It broke Mach 1 in July 1964, the first VTOL aircraft in Europe to exceed the sound barrier. Then, on September 14, 1964, the first prototype was destroyed in a hover crash. The pilot ejected safely. Cancelled in 1968. The German-Italian VAK-191B, 1 vectored thrust engine, 2 lift jets, flew in September 1971. Overweight, underpowered. Cancelled in 1975. Every approach, every country, same result. Separate lift engines added dead weight. Exotic thrust augmentation didn't produce enough lift. Tail sitting was impractical. Multi-engine configurations were maintenance nightmares with catastrophic failure modes. Billions spent. Pilots killed. Programs cancelled. Which brings us to one design office, in one town in Surrey, which found a different way. The Hawker Works at Cambry Park Road in Kingston upon Thames had been presided over since 1925 by Sir Sidney Cam. If you watched our Tempest film, you know this name, you know this lineage. The Hurricane, the fighter that bore the heaviest burden in the Battle of Britain, accounting for more enemy kills than all other British defences combined. The Typhoon, the brutally powerful ground attack fighter that shattered German armour in Normandy. The Tempest, the fastest low-altitude fighter in the European theatre, the aircraft that hunted down V-1 flying bombs. After the war, the Sea Fury, widely regarded as the finest piston-engined fighter ever built. Then the Hunter, one of the most elegant jet fighters of the 1950s, exported to 21 air forces. This wasn't luck. This was a design tradition, decades of accumulated knowledge, each aircraft building on the last. The same office, the same town, the same relentless, practical approach to building fighters that worked. In 1956, a French engineer named Michel Vibeau proposed a ground attack aircraft using a single engine driving 4 centrifugal blowers with vectorable exhaust. Credit where it's due, the seed of vectored thrust started with Vibeau. His proposal reached the NATO Mutual Weapons Development Programme, where it caught the attention of Sir Stanley Hooker at Bristol Engine Company, the man who'd supercharged the Merlin that powered the Spitfire and Hurricane. Hooker immediately saw the potential, but recognised the centrifugal blowers were too heavy and inefficient. He reimagined the concept around a turbofan with rotating exhaust nozzles. In 1957, Hooker contacted Sidney Cam. Cam, in his 60s, but still ferociously creative, grasped the potential instantly. In a famous exchange, Hooker described the engine concept, and Cam reportedly sketched an airframe for it on the spot, demanding to know how soon the engine could be ready. That's the kind of man he was. Show him a problem, and he'd already be drawing the solution before you'd finished explaining it. Ralph Hooper, a talented engineer working under Cam's direction, shaped the airframe around Hooker's engine, the Bristol Siddeley Pegasus. The bicycle undercarriage, the high-mounted intakes, the shoulder wing, the profile that would become unmistakable. On 21st of October 1960, test pilot Bill Bedford achieved tethered hover at Dunsfold Aerodrome in Surrey. On November 19, 1960, the first free hover. By September 1961, full transition. Vertical takeoff to horizontal flight and back. 1 engine, 4 nozzles. That was the whole secret. The Pegasus had 4 rotating exhaust nozzles, 2 forward discharging cold bypass air from the fan, 2 aft discharging hot exhaust from the turbine. Arranged around the center of gravity, they provided balanced lift without separate engines, without gimballing the power plant, without complex wing ducting. The pilot rotated all 4 nozzles using a single lever beside the throttle. Fully aft for speed, fully down for hover, every angle in between. Where France needed 9 engines, where Germany needed 6, where America tried augmented thrust and tail-sitting and lift fans and spent $200 million on an aircraft that couldn't leave the ground, Britain used 1 engine and 4 nozzles. The Pegasus 6 Mark 101 produced 19,000 pounds of thrust. The Pegasus 11 Mark 104, fitted to the GR3 and the Sea Harrier FRS-1, delivered 21,500 pounds. The F402-RR-408 in the American AV-8B reached 23,800 pounds, a 25% increase from the same basic architecture. No redesign, no fundamental rethinking, just continuous refinement of a concept that was right from the beginning. Cam remained closely involved in the aircraft's development until his death on 12 March 1966. He didn't live to see it enter service, but his fingerprints were on every decision that shaped the aircraft. On December 28, 1967, the first production Harrier GR1 made its maiden flight. In April 1969, it entered RAF service, the world's first operational VTOL combat aircraft. From a drawing board in Kingston upon Thames, the impossible had become real. In 1965, a tripartite evaluation squadron had formed at RAF West Raynham, 9 Kestrel aircraft flown by British, American and West German pilots, operating from roads, forest clearings and improvised sites. The American pilots were deeply impressed. They went home knowing they'd seen something their own industry couldn't match. They'd remember that. But the Harrier's real test wasn't a peacetime evaluation by friendly pilots. Its real test was 8,000 miles from home, on the decks of two small carriers, against a determined enemy with numerical superiority and land-based air cover. And it didn't just pass, it dominated. May 1982, the Falkland Islands. Argentina had invaded British sovereign territory in the South Atlantic, and Britain sent a naval task force to take it back. The air component rested almost entirely on the shoulders of the Sea Harrier FRS-1, a navalised variant equipped with the Blue Fox radar and armed with AIM-9L Sidewinder heat-seeking missiles. 20 Sea Harriers sailed south aboard HMS Invincible and HMS Hermes. 800 and 801 naval air squadrons between the two ships. That was it. 20 aircraft standing between the task force and the entire Argentine air arm. The odds were genuinely bad. The Sea Harrier's Blue Fox radar was limited. There was no airborne early warning aircraft in the task force. None. The kind of radar picket coverage that American carrier groups took for granted simply didn't exist. Sea Harrier pilots would be scrambling on short notice, often vectored by ship-based radar operators who could barely see the incoming raids themselves, against fast jets approaching at wave-top height. And the Argentine Air Force wasn't weak. They flew Dassault Mirage 3s, a supersonic interceptor, Israeli-built IAI Daggers, which were essentially unlicensed Mirage 5s, Douglas A4 Skyhawks, small, fast, and wickedly maneuverable, English Electric Canberras flying bombing missions. These weren't obsolete aircraft. Argentine pilots flew with extraordinary courage, often pressing attacks through walls of anti-aircraft fire at mast height. The Sea Harrier shouldn't have dominated. On paper, it was subsonic. Its radar was limited. It operated without the layered defense network that any textbook said you needed. On the 1st of May 1982, the first day of real air combat over the Falklands, the Sea Harriers drew blood. Argentine Mirages and Daggers came in fast and high to challenge the British combat air patrols. They found the Sea Harrier wasn't what they expected. The jump jet they'd probably dismissed as a subsonic novelty was agile. Its pilots were superbly trained, and the AIM-9L Sidewinder they carried was a weapon the Argentines had never faced before. The AIM-9L was an all-aspect variant of the Sidewinder, meaning it could lock onto a target from the front, not just from behind, chasing a hot exhaust pipe. This was a genuine tactical revolution. Argentine pilots who'd trained to defeat older rear-aspect missiles suddenly found themselves being shot from angles they thought were safe. Head-on, beam-on, crossing shots that previous Sidewinders couldn't have taken. The geometry of air combat changed overnight, and the Argentine pilots didn't know the rules had been rewritten until missiles were already tracking them. Lieutenant Commander Nigel Sharkey Ward of 801 Naval Air Squadron aboard HMS Invincible was at the centre of the fighting. Ward was combative, opinionated, and absolutely convinced of the Sea Harrier's superiority. He flew repeated combat air patrols throughout the campaign, engaging Argentine formations with aggressive tactics that pressed every advantage the Sidewinder and the Sea Harrier's maneuverability offered. On the very first day of air combat, he shot down a Mirage 2A with an AIM-9L Sidewinder. The pattern repeated itself across the campaign. Argentine fast jets would race in at low level toward the task force. Ship-based radar would pick them up, sometimes late, sometimes barely at all. Sea Harriers on combat air patrol would be vectored toward the threat, often with very little time and very little altitude advantage. And then the Sidewinders would start flying. On 21st May, the day of the San Carlos landings, the Argentine Air Force threw everything it had at the amphibious fleet. Wave after wave of Skyhawks and daggers screaming in at mast height. Sea Harriers from both squadrons intercepted where they could, often arriving just as the attackers were pulling off their bomb runs. It was chaotic, violent, and desperately close quarters. Some Argentine aircraft got through, ships were hit. But the Sea Harriers extracted a price that the Argentine Air Force could not sustain. And through all of it, every engagement, every scramble, every missile fired, the number of Sea Harriers shot down in air-to-air combat remained the same. 0. 20 Argentine aircraft were shot down in air-to-air combat by Sea Harriers. Mirage 3s, Daggers, Skyhawks, a Canberra, a C-130 Hercules. And not a single Sea Harrier was lost to enemy aircraft in return. 20-0. That number needs to sit with you for a moment. In the entire history of air combat, from the Red Baron over the Somme to the skies over Baghdad, a 20-0 record against a competent, well-equipped enemy air force is almost without precedent. And it was achieved by a subsonic VTOL fighter, flying from 2 small carriers in the South Atlantic, with no airborne early warning, 8,000 miles from the nearest friendly airfield. Weifing, vectoring in forward flight, using the Pegasus nozzles to decelerate suddenly during a dogfight and force an attacker to overshoot, was a tactic the Sea Harrier pilots had practiced extensively in peacetime. Rotate the nozzles partially downward at speed, and the aircraft bleeds energy dramatically, seemingly stopping in mid-air while the pursuer shoots past and becomes the target. It was taught, it was trained, and it was available. How much it was actually used in the fast, violent engagements over the Falklands remains a matter of debate among the veterans themselves. Some swear by it. Others say the engagements happened too quickly and at too great a range for knife fight maneuvers. What isn't debated is what mattered most: the result. 20-0. From ships that conventional wisdom said were too small to operate effective air defense, with an aircraft that conventional wisdom said was too slow to compete with supersonic fighters. The Sea Harrier didn't just prove the VTOL concept, it humiliated every assumption about what a jump jet couldn't do. And here's where the story becomes genuinely beautiful for anyone who watched the world's largest military spend decades and hundreds of millions of dollars failing at this exact problem. The United States Marine Corps adopted the Harrier. They'd been watching since those tripartite evaluation flights at West Raynham in 1965. The American pilots who'd flown the Kestrel went home knowing what they'd seen. And within the Marine Corps, an organization that prized close air support above almost everything else, the idea of a fighter that could operate from a jungle clearing, a forward road, an amphibious assault ship without a catapult was irresistible. Advocates within the Corps pushed the case against significant institutional resistance. Buying foreign was heresy in American defense procurement. The entire domestic aerospace industry had a financial interest in keeping contracts American. Congressmen had districts with jobs at stake. But the Marines didn't have an alternative. Their own country's aerospace giants had tried tail-sitters, thrust augmenters, lift fans, and ejector systems. They'd crashed prototypes, killed test pilots, and spent fortunes. The XFV-12A couldn't even hover. And here was an aircraft, British, operational, proven, that did everything the Marines needed. First came the AV-8A, essentially a standard British Harrier with minor modifications for American avionics and weapons, entering USMC service in 1971. America, the most powerful military nation in history, buying a British combat aircraft because it couldn't build its own. That happened. It's not speculation, it's procurement history. Then came the AV-8B Harrier II, developed jointly with McDonnell Douglas and entering service in 1985. A genuinely improved aircraft, new carbon fibre wing with greater lift and more hardpoints, a raised cockpit for better visibility, redesigned intakes, enhanced avionics. McDonnell Douglas brought real engineering talent to the partnership, and the airframe was significantly better than the original. The Marines flew it in anger during the Gulf War in 1991, over Afghanistan, over Iraq. It became the backbone of Marine Corps expeditionary air power for decades. But the heart of it, the thing that made it work, the thing that no American company could replicate, was British. The Rolls-Royce Pegasus, specifically the F402-RR-408 variant, producing 23,800 pounds of thrust, 4 rotating nozzles, 1 engine. The same fundamental concept that Stanley Hooker and Sidney Cam had sketched out in 1957. Every AV-8B that ever flew, every combat mission over Kuwait, every sortie in the mountains of Helmand, all of them lifted off the ground on British thrust. The most powerful military in history, after failing to solve this problem domestically, came to Britain. And they kept coming back for decades. But the Harrier's legacy doesn't end with the AV-8B. It extends into the most expensive weapons program in human history. The F-35B Lightning II, 5th-generation stealth, the most advanced combat aircraft ever built. And it takes off vertically using a Rolls-Royce lift system, a shaft-driven lift fan behind the cockpit, and a 3-bearing swivel module at the rear, developed by the direct inheritors of the Pegasus engine legacy. Lockheed Martin, building the most ambitious fighter program of the 21st century, partnered with Rolls-Royce specifically because decades of British VTOL research had produced expertise that existed nowhere else on Earth. Historians note that Lockheed entered a data-sharing agreement with Yakovlev in 1991, gaining access to the Yak-141's design data, and that the F-35B's general arrangement, lift fan forward, vectoring nozzle aft, resembles the Freestyle's layout. The extent of that influence is debated, but the actual lift system technology, the hardware that makes it work, came from Rolls-Royce, from Britain. Today, the F-35B flies from the deck of HMS Queen Elizabeth, a British carrier. British VTOL technology, refined across 6 decades, powering the world's most advanced fighter. The lineage runs unbroken, from the Hurricane to the Typhoon, from the Tempest to the Sea Fury, from the Hunter to the Harrier, from the Harrier to the F-35B. One design tradition, one town in Surrey, one cumulative body of knowledge stretching back to a man named Sidney Cam, sitting at a drawing board in Kingston upon Thames. The Americans tried. $200 million on the XFV-12A. Couldn't leave the ground. The Soviets tried. The Yak-38 needed an automatic ejection system because it was too dangerous to trust the pilot's own reactions. The French tried. 9 engines, 2 dead test pilots, program cancelled. The Germans tried. Aircraft destroyed in a hover crash, program cancelled. Britain built the Harrier. 1 engine, 4 nozzles, 20-0 in the Falklands, adopted by the United States Marine Corps because they couldn't build their own. Its technology alive today in every F-35B that lifts off a carrier deck. Every country tried to build a jump jet. Only Britain succeeded. Subscribe for more stories like this.